Welcome everyone to this Learning Informatics seminar. Thank you for joining. This event is hosted by the Learning Informatics Lab in CHD, the University of Minnesota. I'm Bodong Chen. I'm one of the co-directors of the Learning Informatics Lab. Really quickly, the lab was set up to be a truly interdisciplinary space for research, education, and outreach. You can find more about the lab on our website, which I believe will be pasted soon by our colleagues or myself a bit later. But today is really one of the great opportunities the lab aspires to host. That we're going to host a talk given by Dr. David Williamson Shaffer, who is a Willis Distinguished Professor of the Learning Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Educational Psychology. And Dr. Shaffer is one of the leaders in both the learning sciences and learning analytics. And he's also a data philosopher at the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research. And Dr. Shaffer studies how to develop and assess complex and collaborative thinking skills with a particular interest in how students understand complex environmental issues. He's the author of How Computer Games Help Children Learn, and also, which is the focus of the talk, Quantitative Ethnography. And I see Dr. Shaffer as one of the leaders I look up to as I'm developing myself as a scholar in both learning sciences and learning analytics. I still remember a few years ago, I attended one of the earlier workshops about epistemic network analysis, which has been evolving, which is truly amazing to see that set of sophisticated methodology and tools evolving over the years under the leadership of Dr. Shaffer, and right now making an international impact in many, many different fields, including education, medical research, and so on. So I'm truly excited about this talk. I don't want to delay this further, but let's welcome Dr. Shaffer for him to give the talk.
Thank you. Yes, you can hold your applause. Yeah, so this is the first time I've actually traveled anywhere for work since the pandemic, and sort of appropriately, it's an odd hybrid setting, which I haven't really done. So we'll all just muddle along here. But thank you very much to Bodong and David for the invitation, and of course to the center as well. I'm delighted to be here, and in fact, in the pandemic, I'm delighted to be anywhere that isn't my house. In some senses, appropriately during a pandemic, what I'd like to talk about today is scarcity. And so lots of different kinds of scarcity, right? There's scarcity of food, scarcity of oil or other natural resources, scarcity of water. But the kind of scarcity that I want to talk about today is the scarcity of data. Now, data has been scarce, well, basically since as long as there's been data. So Tycho Brahe spent basically his entire life carefully recording the positions of the planets in the sky, and it was that became the basis of Tycho Brahe's laws of planetary motion, which eventually became Newton's Principia Mathematica and more or less started the scientific revolution. And because data is scarce in the social sciences, there have been more or less two main ways of thinking about how to deal with data. One of them is to just collect data about a few individuals, but to collect a lot of data about them. The other, of course, is to collect data about a lot of individuals, but just collect a little bit of data about each of them. Now, I'm not telling you anything new. This is quantitative methods and qualitative methods writ large. But my point here is that qualitative and quantitative methods are both responses to scarcity. And that's a problem because, well, we don't live in an era of data scarcity anymore. And the question becomes, how are we going to make meaning out of that data in a way that's sensible? And what I'm going to argue is that it needs to be both qualitative and quantitative, but hopefully they come together, well, in something that winds up more meaningful than this. Now, you might ask, well, why is big data a problem anyway? Well, what difference does it make that data is not scarce? Well, from a qualitative point of view, we're only interested in a smaller number of individuals anyway. Why does it matter that we have lots and lots of data that we're not able to do anything with if we just take a purely qualitative approach? Well, I mean, part of the issue is if you're only looking at a tiny fraction of the data that's available, you're underpowered, right? You're missing a lot of information that you could be looking at. But worse, there's the problem of confirmation bias, right? The idea that within that data, we will be zooming in on specific things that may simply reinforce what we already believed rather than challenge us in some way. The other name for this, of course, is just cherry picking. Now, similarly, you might say, well, why is this a problem for quantitative data? Right? Quantitative data, broadly speaking, you take a sample of some kind, you take some measurement of the sample, and the question that you're asking is, well, will this measurement generalize to some larger population? We quantify this with a p-value, right? That tells us the likelihood that we'd be making a mistake if we generalize. So why is it bad if we have more data? If we have more data, we can get bigger samples, and we can find things that generalize more easily. This is, of course, just the idea of things being statistically significant. And what the significance test tells us is that we have enough data to make this claim. Okay, so why is that bad, right? It's because, well, here's the problem. So the sample size and p-value are related by this formula, approximately. It's not actually linear, but what that means is as the sample size gets bigger, the p-value is going to get smaller. As the sample size gets really big, the p-value gets really tiny. In other words, we always have enough data to make this claim. Well, so why is that a problem? Well, think about that. In addition to p-values, we get other things from statistics, like we get R-squared values, which is just another name for saying that some kind of statistical test, in this case, right, the R-squared is telling us, if it's 90% or 0.9, is telling us that 90% of the change in one thing is accounted for by the change in another. So, for example, there's research that suggests that about 50% of the differences in people's weight is accounted for by differences in their height, or 25% of people's happiness can be accounted for by their wealth. Of course, this actually isn't directional, so the happier way to think about it is that a quarter of people's wealth can be accounted for by their happiness. In any case, this is just the idea of a correlation. And we can correlate all kinds of things. We can correlate, for example, the impact of teacher feedback or peer tutoring or simulation in games or instructional media, the impact that that has on learning. We can even look at the sort of expected impact of one grade level of education in a subject. The 6% comes because standardized tests are norms, so that one grade level is about a 0.5 effect size, right, between one group and the next. So here's the thing. When I gave you this formula, well, I was cheating a bit because the formula is actually this, which means that as n goes up, p goes down. As n goes way, way up, R-squared goes way, way down. Let me give you an example of this. So this is a study that was done a few years ago about Dragon Box, which is an educational game. For those of you not familiar with Dragon Box, you have the tiles that make up an equation. You can take a tile, and when you drag it across the equal sign, it changes its sign and then cancels out what's on the other side. It's obviously a little more sophisticated than that. So this data set was a data set of 24,000 students who had played Dragon Box. Altogether, they had 21 million data points, where each data point was a move that somebody could make in the game. And there were 540,000 possible things that somebody could do. So our researchers chose, and the moves are things like add A on both sides, subtract A on both sides, subtract A on both sides with merging, and so on. The researchers chose a relatively conservative p-value for their, or alpha level for their significance, right, was 0.001. We should pause, by the way, and say that what that means is if there are 540,000 possible moves that you're testing and you have a p of 0.001, well, you're likely to find 540 of them are significant just by chance alone. But more to the point, when you do the math for this, any one of these moves explains 0.00025% of the variance in learning, which amounts to, if you take 6% as the amount that you learn over the whole year, that's about 1.4 seconds of instruction. Now, I was a teacher, and every 1.4 seconds of instruction is valuable in the classroom. But the question is, how much work do we do to make a change that's that small? Another way of thinking about that, so chess has been studied a lot by cognitive scientists, I suspect because a lot of cognitive scientists like playing chess. And if you look at all the data on chess and you try and compare novices to experts, the single thing that would be most salient is that experts move their pieces faster. And the single worst piece of advice you could give to a novice chess player is to just move your pieces faster. And I make these points because we talk a lot about this notion of data mining, which suggests a scientific process where you understand what the data is and you go through a process of extracting the data. But in fact, a lot of what happens these days is more like data prospecting, where we sort of sift through a bunch of data and hope to find a few nuggets of gold somewhere mixed in there. All of which is just to say that whatever this is, right, it has to in some way focus on things that are important, has to understand what those things mean, and it has to show that these are not just isolated examples that we're picking out of anywhere. The good news is that both qualitative and quantitative methods have a kind of basic pathway through which they work, right? We have a claim that we are interested in making or testing or uncovering, and we have some kind of activity in the world. And the question, of course, is how we go from one to the other. And ideally, right, if we want to make meaning out of this, we have to follow some kind of principled path that is not just about throwing numbers into an algorithm and seeing what pops out. The activity has to get converted into data of some kind. We record the data. That data has to get encoded in some way. And then ultimately, we have to come up with some kind of model, a cultural model in the case of discourse analysis, story in the case of ethnography, and that model, mathematical model or story or cultural model brings us to a claim. And we can call this a primary modeling pathway. That's actually what it's called in evidence-centered design too. The thing that I want to point out about this pathway, though, is that every step in the path is a data reduction. So we start out with activity, and there's a tremendous amount of activity, even in the simplest setting. Anybody who's gone and done field observations knows that. We turn that activity into data, and then we more or less forget about the activity and focus on the data. But notice that the data has a lot less information than the original activity did. We take the data and we turn it into some kind of code, and then we forget about the data and we work with the code. But notice now the code has a lot less data than, or a lot less information than the data did. And then we take the code and we turn it into a model. And now we forget about the codes and we work with the model. And of course, the model also has a lot less information than the codes did, which had less information than the data, which had less information than the activity. And this is actually good. Because what a good model does is it helps us focus on the things that matter. That is assuming that we're actually focusing on the things that matter, right? It condenses the original activity in a way that we can actually sensibly talk about it. The problem comes if the model becomes untethered. Right? So if the model is just a mathematical object and we lose track of the meanings to which it was originally connected, then we get into trouble. Which means that in any model, we have to be able to move back and forth between the model and the codes. We have to be able to understand how those things are related and maintain that relationship so that we can go back to the actual data and interrogate the model in terms of the data itself. Ideally, we'd like to go back to the activity, but of course, that's a little more difficult, mostly because activities don't repeat themselves in the world twice, only data does. This, by the way, is we call in quantitative ethnography closing the interpretive loops. That is being able to go back to the thing that we were interpreting or to the thing that we were modeling to check that our model makes sense. This is, of course, partly just a question of, and this is partly a question of fairness. And by fairness here, I mean both fairness in the sense of equity, but also fairness in the sense that Nelson Goodman talked about a fair sample. The idea of a fair sample is if I have a bunch of bolts of cloth, is the example that Goodman uses. right? So here's a bolt of cloth, and you're considering buying that bolt of cloth. Well, I have to show you some samples. And so the question is, which sample is the one that gives you the best understanding of what the whole will look like? I'm assuming most of us would choose this one in the case of that fabric. And the idea is that the fair sample is one that may be rightly projected to the pattern or mixture or other relevant feature of the whole or further samples. So that's what we're trying to get at ultimately, is the presentation of a fair sample. There are different ways we do that in the world. There's qualitative and there's quantitative methods, but that's our goal. So why start with qualitative methods, or in my case, start with ethnography? Well, ethnography is the science of understanding things that are important to some group of people and what those things mean to them. Ethnography is the study of culture. And I'm borrowing here from work by Jim G, who argues that you can understand a culture in terms of a discourse, which is a socially accepted association among ways of using language, of thinking, feeling, believing, valuing, and acting that can be used to identify oneself as a member of a socially meaningful group or to signal that one is playing a socially meaningful role. That is, our understanding of things is shaped by culture, and of course, contrariwise, our culture is shaped by our understanding of things. Let me just give you a sort of quick example here of how that works. So this is, well, it's a picture of a piece of the ground. I grew up in New York City. As a kid in New York City, a patch of ground led to one question. Is that so muddy that if I walk in it, I will get my shoes dirty? I had no other use for dirt, basically, as a kid. If I'm an archaeologist, I would be more interested in looking at that dirt for evidence of things that had happened in the past. Things like post holes, which are places where a wooden post had been placed at some point in time, indicating some kind of human settlement or activity. The post rots away, and it leaves a patch of soil that's a different color than the original. So in order to analyze these colors of soil, archaeologists use something called the Munsell color chart, which is a universal standard grading of soil colors. And there's other things that archaeologists do. They taste the soil and rub it on their teeth, and other things that make me glad I'm not an archaeologist. The point here is that archaeologists archaeologists think about the soil and Munsell color charts and post holes. And these are the frame, the lens with which they're looking at soil, which is very different than the lens that I was using to look at the dirt. And in technical terms, things like soil and Munsell color charts and post holes are codes, right? And a code is just a culturally relevant and meaningful part of a discourse. It's one of the things that people attend to from some cultural perspective. And if you don't believe me that post holes are an important cultural part of the discourse of archaeology, I would submit that one of their journals is called The Post Hole. Now, of course, the point of these codes, right, is not just that we care about soil and Munsell color charts and post holes. We do. But what's important is that a Munsell color chart is something that you use to analyze the color of soil in order to understand whether there are things like post holes. That is, these codes are related to one another in systematic ways. So that makes our analysis a process of choosing a culture, trying to understand its discourse by identifying its codes, and then identifying the relationships between those codes. So let me give you a quick example of this from work that I did some time ago. It's an example from the field of education, but the fact that it's from education is actually not the point here. And it's about classroom dialogue. It's actually students chat on an online chat, but that's also not the point. You can do this with websites or interviews or Twitter or any other kind of data that you might want to be thinking about in a similar context. This is data from a game called Rescue Shell. Students are building a robotic exoskeleton, or designing one, I guess I should say. It's a jigsaw design, so they work on one part of the problem in groups, and then they gather together and they talk about the information that they got in each of their groups. And what we're looking at is one of those groups right after the jigsaw. So here we can see Justin Kim, who's the mentor leading the group, ask them to take a moment to introduce themselves. He basically says, okay, let's start with this collaboration. The students all introduce themselves, and then the conversation takes a turn when Daniel says, so what was everyone's results? You did this work with this part of the problem. What did you actually get? And what we see in the next turns are people talking about the different requirements for the design that they were exploring, right? So Zachary says we got safety close to the company requirement. Daniel says we were able to reach internal consultants' requests, and so on. The conversation takes another turn when Michael says, well, what were the actual results? Like, tell me what actually happened. I got it that they were good, but what actually happened? He's making a request for the data. And what we see in the next turns of talk is people talking about the actual data that they got. Agility was 263, payload was 552. I don't actually know what those numbers mean in this context, but they're essentially ratings that you get back in some units that they're not talking about because they all share that information. And then finally, Elizabeth, at the end of this little screen, says we need to determine which attributes are the most important to us so we can meet those internal requirements, and the company, then just the company for the ones that we think are less important. Basically, what she's saying is we have to think about design trade-offs here. We're not going to be able to meet all the requirements, so which ones are the most important and how are we going to trade off against them? Okay, and scene. I just told you a little story, and it involved 4 codes: collaboration, technical requirements, data, and design trade-offs. People started talking about collaboration, which led to a discussion of technical requirements. Somebody got frustrated that they weren't hearing about the data, so they asked about the data. And then when somebody heard all the data, they started thinking about how to make design trade-offs. So I was arguing that what we're thinking about is the connections between the codes. This story is essentially a drawing about one particular way of connecting these codes. Well, what does it mean to connect 2 codes in the first place? Well, if we look at this little piece of data when Michael asked, sorry, this part of our story, when Michael asked about data, we can see that he's doing so in response to previous discussions about technical requirements. And so we can think about organizing the information that we have in some kind of chronological order by group, where at any given point in time, when somebody's saying something, there's a common ground that the group shares. It's the things that everybody in the group kind of has on the table, and everyone else can take for granted that the other people understand is being talked about. It's literally just a way of saying, when somebody says this, the common ground is the things that they might be referring to. There's a lot more to be said about how that's constructed and why and so on, but we'll talk about that in a workshop later today, or you can read about it in some of the things that we've written. Anyway, the idea is you can take this little window of common ground, you slide it along until you see somebody says something that connects to another code back in the common ground. And then we can say, okay, well, so those 2 things are connected in like a little network. I keep sliding the window and maybe other things are connected, other things get connected. And then if I take all the different windows for each person and sum them up, I get a network for any one person. So this is the basic idea of epistemic network analysis. And what I'd like to do, assuming all the technology works, is show you a little video. It's a clip from Law and Order. I'm forgetting the name. Trigger warning. They're talking about, we're talking about a crime that involves a woman and her baby. And so that's going to bother you. You can just close your eyes and, or close your ears or whatever, and the talk will still make sense. What you're going to see as the, excuse me, in the video here is this short discussion between some of the colleagues in Law and Order. Across the top is going to be actually the transcript, so what your data might ordinarily look like. And then you will see the epistemic networks being constructed based basically on the principle that I was just describing.
Psych defense?
Well, it'll be hard going if she is.
Because she's faking it.
No, because DSM-4 diagnostic standards still don't exist for postpartum psychiatric illnesses.
Here we go.
Many courts bar its admission. That's the reason why infanticide sentences vary so wildly in this country. Some women are given the death penalty, and others are given probation.
You think postpartum depression should excuse murdering your child?
It's not depression. I think she's suffering from postpartum psychosis.
Giving birth made her crazy.
It's a hormonal imbalance stemming from pregnancy. Its onset can be quick and severe. Its symptoms include agitation, hallucinations, delusions.
The Andrea Yates defense.
Look, the only thing making this girl crazy is the baby's father. I don't know what part he played, but I know that he's involved.
Liv.
So as we're listening to this discussion, it appears that these 3 people have a different perspective on the same problem. And now we can look at their network models and see that, in fact, there are differences that we can observe between the ways in which they're thinking about the issues. We can produce a mathematical model that represents the way in which these people are connecting up these codes. Well, what does that look like in terms of the group we were just looking at? Well, this is what their model looks like. So more or less similar to the one that I showed you. This is the model for Michael. And if you remember, Michael is the person who asked for data in response to technical requirements, and that's the connection right there. This is Elizabeth's model. You may remember Elizabeth was the person who asked about design trade-offs in response to the discussion of data. That's the connection right there. And that's her talking about it. Now, I just kind of plopped this network up here, and I didn't tell you at least one important piece of information, which is where did I put the nodes in the network? So there is actually a way in which the mathematics with which that's constructed. It's not arbitrary. I'm not going to talk about it here because it actually isn't that important in our context, in the same way that talking about the details of a t-test or wouldn't be important in this context. But the thing that you need to know is that the way the algorithm works, it optimizes the node points in the following way. If this is the data point for a person, the connections are going to be heaviest around where that point is. So if I have a data point over here, the connections are going to be heavier over there. So for example, Michael's data point is up here because his connections are heaviest up towards the top. Elizabeth's data point is here because her connection was heavy kind of in the middle there. And if I pick another person in the discussion, Zachary, for example, I could predict that his connections would be lower down and to the right of the space, which is exactly what happens. So what this means, excuse me, what this means is instead of just being able to look at a few students' data and compare their networks by hand or by eye, I can actually look at many students, perhaps say a group of more advanced engineering students. And I can look at where all their points are, and I can compute their mean, and or do other statistics. And I can compute their mean network, and their mean network is going to correspond to where the mean is in the space. In this case, we can see that the advanced students are making connections between technical requirements and data in the context of discussing design trade-offs. I could look at more novice students and compute their points and their mean and their network. In this case, the novices are driven by a lot of discussion of collaboration. It turns out in the data, there's a lot of discussion about who should do what. And when they're more advanced, they don't have to spend as much time doing that because they have some idea about what the roles are and what people should be doing. And now, of course, I can compare the two. I can conduct a t-test. But now notice when I conduct my t-test, the R² value is 12%, not 0.0000025%. And I can interpret this right in terms of the original diagram, the differences between experts and novices. I can see the story that I told represented at a larger scale, and now use statistical tools to warrant that the thing that I saw is something that I'm going to see more than once. By the way, for those of you who are paying attention, this model here is more or less the original model that we started with. And what that means is we now can see that this thing that we were looking at, that in fact, this change from technical requirements to data to design trade-offs exists. It's just a characteristic of the more advanced students. And it happens the group we were looking at was in that more advanced cluster, as you saw. What this means is that the single pattern that we can look at in depth is something that repeats itself in the data. It's not, we can't generalize to all students everywhere, but within the data we have, we can make a generalization. And if we were able to see these same students over and over again, doing the same sort of thing, we wouldn't need to keep looking because we've seen the pattern. We've established what's called in qualitative research theoretical saturation. But we've been able to do it using a statistical warrant. The other important property here is that when we construct this model, we can look at any one point, and that point actually contains the network that corresponds to that student. And for that network, we can interrogate any one of the connections and go back and see in the data where the connections took place. In other words, when when we're doing this, right? Sorry, I don't know why that slide's in there. What we're doing is closing interpretive loops, right? And we're doing it because we can link a computational approach with a grounded approach. And those two things are connected. The connection doesn't get lost. Now, one of the things you may notice is that in order to do all of this, I had to take the data and I had to make some claims about it. I had to say, here's where we're talking about technical requirements, and here's where we're talking about data. That was an intrinsic part of the story. In other words, in order to get to this right-hand side, right, where I'm talking about a culturally relevant and meaningful aspects of a discourse, I have to start with the actual discourse itself. That's what happened in the world. And then I collect some data. Field notes is what we call it in ethnography. And I somehow have to get from the field notes over to these interpretations. And the thing that makes that bridge is codes, but now with a small c. So just as a big C code is a property of a big D discourse, a small c code is the things in the data that you would actually, that would tell you that that big C code is happening. It's the things that count as evidence or warrants for the codes. And what that gives us is this connection across here. And this connection is central to all of ethnography, all of qualitative research, all of quantitative research, and in fact, central to any research at all, because that's the connection that takes us from the world of data to the world of interpretation. It's what lets us understand this complex interplay of how people make sense of the world and how they talk and act and think by understanding what's happening in the data. Of course, that means if that central connection goes haywire, well, we don't actually know necessarily that we are coding what we think we're coding. The data and the interpretation doesn't necessarily line up. Right? And so what we get is essentially a potential bunch of nonsense because we haven't established that link between data and interpretation clearly. Now, there are a few different ways people do that. Right? The first of them is by hand coding. People are probably familiar with this. You pick a code, you define the code, you provide some examples, and then if you have time, you do some kind of validation. Some people do social moderation or dual coding, which just means two people come to agreement on all of the data, which is a very good way of getting good agreement. It's also exhausting. People sometimes encode part of the data and then compute some kind of inter-rater reliability statistic. Basic idea there is if one person codes, we're not exactly sure that the meanings align. If two people code, we're still not sure, but we've bounded that uncertainty, which is basically the job of all statistics, is just bounding uncertainty. And then we all are familiar with sort of this coding loop, right? Somebody picks a code, they code a test set, they give that test set to somebody else, they compute inter-rater reliability. If it's good, they stop. If not, they go on. So this is pretty common. And it's basically just a matter of two people coming to agreement. But that still doesn't scale very well for all the obvious reasons. Another method that people have used more in recent years is machine learning and natural language processing, where basically, excuse me, you give to the machine a set of coded data, and it takes that coded data and it infers the features of the data that it can use to code more data. Problem is, you actually have to give it a lot of data for it to work well. So it still winds up being pretty tiring. Worse, you get codes that are not necessarily particularly interpretable. It's some strange combinations of features in the data that the machine happens to have identified, but it's not clear why those should be symbols of the code in the first place. And because you're basically getting IRR with the machine, the kappas tend to be, the statistics tend to be very low because the machine doesn't really understand the data in any meaningful sense. Third way that people do this is with topic modeling. So in topic modeling, we just give the machine the raw data, and it returns collections of words that could be used to reconstruct the data, basically, but in a probabilistic model, like usually some kind of latent Dirichlet allocation. So the challenge there, I mean, the good thing there is that we get these classifiers, and the classifiers have words, like it's actual, those are intelligible. Sometimes you get words that don't make much sense in there because the machine doesn't understand the words, it's actually just looking at when they co-occur within documents. Whereas still, you don't actually have a code, all you have is a bag of words. You can try and interpret what that bag of words meant, but it didn't start with the interpretation, which means that you don't actually have a code. All you have is your guess at a bag of words, and you actually don't get any IRR at all. mean, you can, but it's extremely time intensive. You're basically just taking the machine's word for it. So we have not so much IRR as just, well, R. Now that isn't to say that these things don't have their place. Like topic modeling is a great way to start to get some sense of what might be interesting in your data, but that's not the same as making the link that you're interested in when you're starting to make claims about what's happening in the world. Problem is that actually all of these methods, all three of them, are fundamentally broken. And they're fundamentally broken because there's a sampling problem. And what I mean by that is when two raters code a test set, doesn't matter whether they're humans or human in a machine, right? They code a test set and they take some measurement on it. Let's say kappa, could be an F statistic, there's lots of things you could use. And then if the kappa of our little test set is above the threshold, we just assume that the rest of the data is above the threshold. Well, that's like saying I'm going to measure the people in this room, find their average height, and if their average height is over 6 feet, I'm just going to assume everybody in Minnesota has an average height of over 6 feet. In other words, we've done this, but we haven't computed any kind of p-value. Just to give you a sense of the prevalence, we looked at some journals. That's actually not to the present quite. It was a couple of years ago we stopped, but we looked at 44 articles that used kappa. They computed 141 kappa values. And the number of times that they actually tested to see whether the kappa was significant was 0. So we did a Monte Carlo study to see, well, how much of a problem is this, right? It turns out it's actually a very big problem. In order to get reliable estimates of kappa, you have to have test sets, not total amount coded, but the actual test set has to be like 400 or 800 lines, which is way bigger than many people use. And you have to have codes that are incredibly prevalent. In the universe where most work gets done over here, we have error rates as high as 30%. And if that's true, that means that a study with 6 codes has about a 74% chance that at least one code is wrong. So that's kind of a problem. The problem is that these statistics have a highly non-normal distribution. So it's difficult to analytically compute confidence intervals. We developed a Monte Carlo rejective method, which we'll talk about more in the workshop, but basically we construct a bunch of sets under the null hypothesis. We sample those. We get a distribution of the sample under the null hypothesis. And then we can see where the sample that we saw compares to the distribution. And we get a statistic called rho, which is the only thing you need to know here. And what rho does is essentially provides a p-value when you're doing inter-rater reliability with statistics like kappa, F statistics and precision and recall and accuracy and all those other things. What rho lets us do is instead of doing this, which leads to this, we do this, compute kappa and the statistic that gives us its statistical significance so that we do this. More than that, we can use rho to build a more efficient coder. So we've used rho to build something called encoder. It uses almost the same process of hand coding. You start by picking some keywords or expressions or things that you think are indicative of the code. The computer goes and tests the set, and using some mathematical magic, it comes up with a test set that's very efficient for you to code. We can then, and I can say more about that in the workshop, but we then use rho to test, and you'll notice that the kappa value there is, we use 0.9 as our low. Not 0.65, not 0.7, not 0.6 sometimes, 0.9. And what this process gets us is classifiers that are relatively intelligible. Those are regular expressions for those of you who don't read regular expression. It's just a pattern of words. We get very high kappas that are statistically significant, and we do it in way less time. Total amount of excerpts coded, if it's anything but the most complicated code, is usually less than 1,000, sometimes less than 500. It's an incredibly efficient process. And it's efficient because it's a process of active machine learning. And what that means is when the machine codes the data and those codes come back, right, we have 2 different things we can do to resolve the differences. One is we can tell the machine what we were looking at. That means that this code is present. And so instead of just guessing based on a whole bunch of coded data, we're actually telling the machine what the feature it should focus in on. But almost as often early in the coding process, what happens is the rater actually changes their mind. We come to understand the definition of the code more precisely. because as the machine operationalizes our definition, we have to think deeply about what we actually meant. It presents us with possible counterexamples, and we have to be more precise in our own thinking, not just in what we tell the machine. My colleague Golnaz Rastapur at Clemson describes this as a process of directly confronting biases and assumptions in ourselves and in our tools. This is not just a process by which we are automating things that we do. It's a process by which we bring our qualitative perspective and the quantitative perspective into dialogue and make both of them stronger. Or as Seymour Papert says, debugging is a process of developing understanding. We fix problems in the classifier to reveal our own understanding. In other words, coding is a process that is partly computational, but also partly grounded. In the same way that the model I showed you with epistemic network analysis is partly computational and partly grounded. But the thing is, it's not just any computer program, right? It's computer programs, it's a computational method that borrows on the best of what we know about how to do good quantitative research. Empirical statistics as well as more classic analytics statistics. And it's not just grounded in the general sense that we're looking at it and think that this is what it means. It's grounded in the way that good qualitative research is grounded, using all the same tools and techniques to think about bias and to think about theoretical saturation, all those other issues. In other words, we're not just generalizing some qualitative research result, and we're not just checking some quantitative research result by showing, well, here's some examples, and so you can see that the result makes sense. These are actually dialogic. They're in conversation with one another, and what comes out of that conversation is stronger than what either one of them would say alone. Which is why, instead of thinking about this as a mixed method, with its analogy to chemistry, where you take two things and put them together in a mixture, but they remain separable. So like chicken soup is a good example of a mixture. Put the chicken in the soup. When I'm done, I can take the chicken back out of the soup, and I have soup and I have chicken. Instead, we can think of a solution that is like lemonade. I put the sugar and the lemon juice in the water. Once I mix it up into lemonade, I can't pull the sugar out easily. And so rather than mixed methods where we do something that's qualitative, we do something that's quantitative, and we triangulate between the two. Maybe we give a survey and then we use that survey to interview some people. That's a relationship, but it's not actually unified. They're not actually having the qualitative and the quantitative methods in conversations with one another about the same data. It's when we do this that we get grounded models with meaningful variables that aren't black boxes. That's the process by which, instead of giving people feedback that may be statistically sound but doesn't actually mean anything, we're able to provide information that's going to be useful for teachers or for students or for policymakers or for whoever else is interested in understanding the world that we are modeling qualitatively and quantitatively. Let me close there because I'm at about what I was hoping was time. I want to thank the National Science Foundation for their generous funding for this work in many ways over many years. There are many international collaborators, only some of whom are represented here, who have worked on this. In fact, there's a whole learned society of people who have contributed to this work now. Folks in my own lab who have done fabulous work over time making this happen. For those who want to know more, there is a workshop this afternoon. There's also books about quantitative ethnography. There's an international conference of quantitative ethnography, which will be in Copenhagen in October, and the submission deadline is May 15th, as you can find that online. There's data challenges and workshop series and other activities throughout the year online that people can participate in. Yeah, I think that's everything. Oh, and there's an international society, qesoc.org, that you can be a part of. And there's also our website, epistemic-analytics.org, which talks about these tools, although I think there's less information there about QE in general. All right, so let me stop there, and I'm going to not stop sharing my screen in case somebody has something specific that they want to ask about. But thank you all thank you for my big audience. So tell me how we want to take questions in this sort of virtual, somewhat virtual universe of what we're doing.
Thank you so much, David. I don't know how to do it. This is the first time doing it. So maybe I can monitor the questions from the online audience. And if there are questions in the room, we can also start from the questions in the room as well. So, but I invite all the participants, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute and directly ask your question, or if you prefer to submit your question through the chat, feel free to do that as well. So I'll take a pause, and in case there's any question from the room, we can maybe start from the room.
I'm happy to kick us off. This talk was so great. First, thank you so much. I feel so grateful to be here. I was hoping to just ask a really just specific clarifying question about what it means for two nodes to be connected in a network.
Sure.
So I understand that you have data, you have coded that data, you know, into particular categories of themes. A connection means that those themes appeared within a particular window in the data set.
So as always in this, so first of all, yes, although there's a slight amendation to how it's computed, which we can talk about in a second. But what's important, right, is that you can think about this notion of connection both from the data side and from the interpretation side. And so on the data side, yes, you're correct. We compute a connection by saying for each line of data has a recent temporal context or a common ground, and anything that's in that line is connected to anything that's in the common ground. And there's a few conceptual reasons for that. Right, one is this common ground is sort of the things that are taken as shared at that moment. What you'll find happens is if I want to refer to something that happened 20 minutes ago, I will re-invoke it. I will introduce it back into the conversation because I don't assume that everybody else has that in the front of their mind. That common ground is the things that I think everybody else is paying attention to right at that moment. And it's actually a relatively stable distance because it's not how long you can remember, it's how long I think you can remember. And since we generally assume that people aren't that bright, right? We assume that there's some short window of time over which you'll remember it, otherwise I have to tell you again. So that's what that window represents. And you know, so the other thing about that window is there's a notion in discourse analysis of a dispreferred response. And the idea of a dispreferred response, sort of in simple terms, is if you say, well, that example won't work here. But if you say, do you want to go out to lunch? And I say, oh, we just got a new cat. It's dispreferred in the sense that not that it's not the wrong, it's the wrong answer. It's just not even the kind of answer that you would have expected. And a dispreferred response is a conversational response in the same way that if you said, do you want to go to lunch? And I said, I just got a new cat, you'd be a little miffed because you were actually expecting I was going to respond. So in that sense, there's still a connection between those two things, even if I wasn't making the connection directly by saying something in response, I'm making it. So that's sort of well, that's the conceptual and the technical side. Right? So the technical side is co-occurrence. The interpretive side is there's a relationship between those ideas in my mind. Right? I think of those things as one logically as part of the other. And so the reason that that's helpful is it accounts for, so this model does some, as everybody knows, right, there's like sequential pattern mining and state transition diagrams. There's a whole bunch of things that people use to model data in this way. Sequential pattern mining takes account of the exact sequence of events. A followed B, or A was followed by B, was followed by C, was followed by D. This doesn't do that. It takes account of temporality, which means I said C, or I said D in the context of A, B, and C, but I haven't specified the exact order. The notion of specifying the exact order is very helpful if I believe that there is actually a specific order in which things should happen. So like in well-formed problem solving. But if not, if I'm in an open-ended domain, I'm creating confusion because now A, B, C, D is a different thing than A, C, B, D, which is a different thing than B, A, C, D, and so on, right? So I have this sort of explosion of things that, unless I care about the specific order, actually are treated as different but should be the same. On the other hand, if I use a number of other techniques, state transitions, for example, I can either model the group as a whole, or I can model each individual's data. But modeling each individual in the context of the group is difficult. And this notion of that sliding window of recent temporal context makes it possible to do that. And so there's a kind of technical mathematical piece, but it's in service of trying to operationalize understanding how a person understands things in a context where other people are also making contributions and they're responding to them. Yeah.
This doesn't look like it. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's, Bodong, did you hear the original question?
I could hear a little bit of that, but
Okay.
if the person, yes,
I'll repeat it.
or if you repeat, that'd be wonderful.
Okay. So then you could repeat.
Yeah.
Following up on that, if you can go back to the slide where there's a thing with the dots and the connections.
Sorry, what the?
So there is a slide where it has all of the dots and in a plane.
Oh, yes, yes.
And the dimensions. And I know you mentioned that you were gonna say looking more at how those dots are divided, where they fall. But I'm really curious.
Yeah. You're talking about, get back there. Well, let me get back to where you're talking about that.
So is this starting an overlap in a space where all of the main ideas out of this discourse or conversation are loaded with certain precision, and then the connections are weighted?
Yeah, so this is a great question. You're now making me give the math part of the talk that I left out for the sake of time. No, it's fine. So the question is basically, you said you would talk about this later, and it was beyond the scope of this talk, but I want to put it in the scope of the talk, basically. Okay, so the question is, where do these points come from? And I'm just going to get an image where there's just, yeah, this is a good one. Okay, so let me give the very mathematical explanation, or the reasonably mathematical explanation, and then we can come back to sort of the more intuitive part. But so any network can be thought of as a matrix. They're more or less isomorphic to one another, right? So if I have this network with technical requirements, design trade-offs, collaboration, and data, I can think of that as a matrix where I have down the rows, technical collaboration, design, data, and collaboration, and across the columns, the same things. And each cell tells me the strength of the association, the line weight between them.
Oh, and that's how big the line.
Correct, right? Okay, so, and that number is literally the number of turns of talk. In this case, the data's turns of talk. If it was interviews, it could be questions. It depends on how you define your lines of data. But the number of lines of data where there was a connection between, let's say, data and collaboration somewhere in that recent temporal context. It's the number of those windows, they're called stanzas, but the number of those windows in which that co-occurrence happened. That's proportional to the thickness of the line. Excuse me. So basically all you have is a matrix for each, well, whatever your unit of analysis is. In this case, it's individuals. If we were doing the group as the unit of analysis, if we were doing the individual in under a certain time period, whatever that unit is, I get a matrix. So a matrix, as we know, is just a string of numbers. So we can treat that matrix as if we can treat that matrix as a point in some high dimensional space. In this case, it's a 16-dimensional space. Right? All right, Brennan? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wait. Yeah. Hang on. Yes, right. So there's a long vector that represents each network. They're up in a cloud of points and somewhere in the great cloud of points in the sky. And then what we're going to do is a projection, dimensional reduction from that high dimensional space down to a two-dimensional space. There are lots of ways you can do dimensional reductions. You could do a singular value decomposition. You could do a singular value decomposition with centering and rescaling. There's a whole bunch of ways you could do that. For those of you who are not as mathematically inclined, you think about it, if you had a cloud of points in space and you just wanted to take a picture, right? That would reduce the cloud of points to a two-dimensional view. Depending on where you put the camera, you would see different things. So you have to choose where you want to put the camera. In this case, for this particular model, the camera was chosen so that the x-axis goes through the means of the two groups. Good, because it gets us the most information about the difference between the means of the two groups. For those of you who are really, really mathematical, it's an LDA that's done with assuming equal variance on the dimensions. In any case, so that's what gets us the points. Now your question is, well, what gets us the dots, right? And so the idea here is, imagine that Zachary's network here was an actual physical object. We had constructed it out of balsa wood. There would be a place where that object would balance its center of mass, or mathematically its centroid. Every object has one. And what we want to do is position the nodes so that that center of mass lines up with where Zachary's point is. There's lots of ways we could do that for Zachary, but if we had to do it for all 50 students, it gets more and more constrained. It's actually just a regression, right? Where you take the weighted, it's basically the weighted sum predicts the x position of the points. The result, though, is what we were just saying, which is there's a correspondence between the location of the point, which is mathematically determined based on the original network, and the position of the lines that are thickest, which means that these two views, the network graph and the dimensional reduction, are co-registered. I can interpret one in terms of the other. So this lets me give meaning to the axes when I make a statistical comparison, and lets me retain the visualization of any individual point or the groups as a whole. And that's what lets me tunnel back down to the actual data. So in the ENA tool, which with the WebKit, you can actually do that. You can actually click on a line and it will pull up all the instances in the data where that correspond to those co-occurrences. So it's really easy to say, wait, does this co-occurrence mean what I think it means? And you say, well, yeah, there's 10 times. Yeah, that's got it right. Or wait a minute, this isn't what I meant by X or Y. That's, of course, the reason why we need a coding mechanism that gets us reliability up at 0.9, cap up at 0.9. Because if any of you have ever made a system, which we have done, where you're taking something that students are doing and you're giving the teacher or the students some information about it, I promise you, they're looking very carefully to see whether things are coded correctly. And when you have a cap of like 0.65, there are errors all over the place. You can have a really high error rate and still maintain cap of 0.65. And those errors are deadly when you're trying to convince somebody that the interpretation that you've made is actionable. So you really have to get it to the point where there aren't that many mistakes either in the interpretation of the connections, but certainly not in the imputation of the codes. That was probably more than you wanted answered, but did I at least answer the part that you actually wanted? Okay, all right. But yeah, I have a bad habit of doing that. Somebody asks me a question and I answer the 3 questions before it and the 3 questions after it right now.
All right,
That's
David, I see
everyone in the room. Yeah.
Yes, I see a question in the chat,
Okay.
which I can read out if that
That'd be
helps.
great. Thank you.
Yeah, so this question comes from Jia Yu, who is asking, can you talk a little bit about how researchers' experience and expertise can contribute to our understanding of the data? Is there a potential for DEI research? I assume it's diversity, equity, inclusion research.
Yeah. So there are people in the QE community who are working specifically on issues of D and E. I don't know how many people are working on I, but it's not. I think that's just happens to be nobody has picked that up yet. But yes, there are definitely people who are doing work with those concerns. And I guess what I would say is, well, you're probably all familiar with the concept of GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Right? So if you have a researcher who doesn't actually have expertise and experience with the data, to understand the data, that your model is going to be nonsense. Right? This all has to start with some kind of grounded understanding of the data. Statistics are, you can do exploratory analyses, of course, in the same way that you use a topic model to give you a kind of window into the data. You could put some codes together, you could run an ENA analysis, and you could say, oh, here's this difference, let me go investigate it. But unless you actually come to understand the data, either before you start with the statistics or in the process of an exploration, the results are meaningless. Like, what's there is no way to simply induce an answer. I mean, I know that there are people who have said, you know, we have enough data now, correlation is enough. We can just put everything in the machine and we'll discover patterns that we never saw before. But as we saw, like, most of those patterns are going to be meaningless, and the only way to tell whether they're meaningless or not is to look at the data and understand it. So I would say it's not just that there's a role for it. There is no data analysis, good data analysis without it. If I've understood your question correctly, the researcher is central to all of this, in the same way that they are in straight up qualitative analysis and in straight up quantitative analysis, I would say. You know, one way to look at it is if a QE analysis is only as good as the Q and the E. Right? You know, those have to be right. It can add value on top of them, but if either one of those is no good, then the whole thing is no good.
I have a question that kind of builds on this question, which I find fascinating in your talk. You had really detailed ways of putting signs, like either a human or a machine, besides those different steps and components. Mm-hmm. And which I find fascinating is this, you are trying to be really explicit about who is doing what, and at which stage, and who is bringing what contribution to this whole QE work, right? So I wonder, can you talk a little bit about this kind of partnership between the human and the tools and machines, and how you're looking at the relationship between them within the QE project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about that relationship most prominently in the questions about coding rather than about modeling, although I think the same things would apply. I just haven't thought of it this way because right now the machine doesn't, the models are not really an active machine learning process in the way that the coding is. So that isn't to say that there isn't a relationship, it's just not what I've thought about as much. In the coding, the way that I think about it is that there are two things that you're concerned about. Well, there's three things. So what you're concerned about is fairness. And what I mean by fairness in this case is fairness to the data. That is, whatever claim or model you're doing actually represents the data itself. There's fairness to theory, meaning the things that you are saying are meaningful. The meanings that you're imputing are meanings that actually correspond to whatever theory you're in conversation with. And it's fair to the people from whom the data was generated, meaning that you're not saying that things mean something or that something is happening that they wouldn't think is an appropriate representation. And so humans, there's parts of that only the human can really do, at least currently, right? So the fairness to theory and the fairness to the people who generated it are mostly in the hands of the human. And we don't really expect that the machine is going to understand the theories in any deep way. We don't really understand that the machine is going to understand the people in any deep way. What the machine will understand is what the machine works with is the data. And so how do you think about being fair to that data? Well, being fair to the data means essentially that the claims that you make are actually exist throughout the data and rather than just in the portion that you've looked at. And that's kind of the machine's job. And so the way we think about coding is you actually want to get three-way reliability. So you want two humans and a machine. The two humans together, it gives you some belief that the theory is being reliably executed. you can do some kind of, there's a bunch of ways you can do member checking and other things, obviously, to get the community in. A person and a machine, right, gives you some sense that what is being coded is in fact true to the valid meaning. And then you actually need to get both people aligned with the machine, because you could get one person who's aligned with the machine, the other person, and aligned with the other person, but these two actually don't connect. So you have to get a kind of triangular agreement. But I think that what that suggests is, I'm hemming a little bit, Bodong, because I actually never thought about the question in exactly the way you asked it. So I'm kind of thinking on the fly here, which is fun. But so when I teach methods classes, especially qualitative methods classes, one of the things I say to the students is that data doesn't talk, it talks back. It's like a surly teenager. But you have to make some assertion or interrogate the data in some way, and then it grunts and grudgingly says the yes or no, the way that my teenage daughters do. And I think in some ways that's similar of the relationship between the human and the machine, right? Really, this is not a completely equal partnership, and that our job is to use the tools that a machine can provide to enhance what we're doing, rather than give data to the machine and then let it tell us what the right answer is. I take very seriously the supervised part of supervised machine learning.
Thank you, David. This is really helpful. I think it's maybe another way to characterize this kind of augmentation approach versus AI approach. You try to augment what research do and position researchers still in the center of the work. So,
yes, I think that's right. And it's not that I have a problem with AI. My concern is always about questions of validity, basically. I try not to use the word validity because it's so loaded in the discourse already. But the challenge with using an AI method is that when you come to validate it, it actually takes a lot of work. Like with topic modeling, it takes a lot of work to validate it, and sometimes you're better off just training something more explicitly to think about the problem the way that you as the researcher think about it. That's not universally true of AI, obviously, but once you give up the idea that a human being should be able to look at the results and pretty reliably think that whatever the machine just said is what they would have said, if you give that up, then machines can be very powerful. But if you want to maintain that link, then there's a lot of work that goes into, and the more black box something becomes, the harder it is to train out the bad information. I mean, just look at what's happening with facial recognition, right? There's all this training of these neural networks. They trained it on a data set that was overloaded from one group, and it created all kinds of problems. And it's hard to unwire because you don't want to retrain the whole thing. I mean, if you were to ask me, like, what do I think the biggest questions in this sort of research are, QE research and kind of research that's doing this human-machine combination. I think one of them is in participatory research. So how is it that we include participants in this discussion of things that are very mathematical or very mathematical looking? And there are people working on that, and we have some solutions that we'll show you, and at least one solution we'll show you in the workshop. So I think that's important. I think thinking about indigenous groups and other people who are marginalized, and the way in which these tools interact with those groups and ideally empower those groups. So just to give you a quick example, there are a number of cultures which don't really put much stock in numbers and put stock in stories. And so if a government agency is giving money for a project in a group that context, right, the measurement of success from the community's point of view is in terms of stories, not in terms of Likert scales or numbers of patients or whatever it is that you're working on. And so finding a way to bridge the gap between stories and the kind of quantitative representation that funders are going to want is would be really empowering. So there are folks who are working on that question. And I think a third question that's really important is what I conceptualize as the subgroup fairness problem. But it's basically, what do you do with the fact that there are always going to be marginalized groups in your data? And any approach that does some kind of, uses some kind of automation, actually any approach at all, but certainly one that uses automation, is going to systematically represent those groups differently or potentially than the majority population in the data. And so we have an SF grant to think about that in terms of coding. We're thinking about it pretty actively in terms of these models. So those would be three big ones. I mean, I think the fourth category of things is just how do we think, what happens to these tools when we challenge them with different kinds of data and contexts? So the ISQE is actively interested in bringing in people from policy and from medicine and from law and from planning and other places where the data looks different and the questions look different, because not only does that mean the toolkit expands, but we actually understand more about the assumptions that were baked in from the original context. You start to unpack those and it gives you a deeper theoretical understanding of the domain you're working in.
Thanks, David. Since she's ready to ask your question, and then maybe we can swing back to the room to see whether we have questions from the live audience. So she, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Shaffer. Thank you so much for your great talk. I have a question relates to the size of stanza window, which is quite related to the representation of the matrix of the association of pairs of codes. So I wonder how you think about the size of this window setting is sensitive to the matrix that we got. I know this probably very depend on the domain of those lines that we put in. And do you have general recommendations for empirical researchers when we think about this question then?
Yeah, well, so it's a good question. And of course, the point is, if I make the window bigger, I'm going to get bigger numbers in the matrix, like just period, full stop. I think about that in a few ways. So one of them is, in a sense, the ground truth is to go through the data and see if you can figure out what's actually the distance back that people are going. A way of thinking about that is sort of through deixis, which is just reference in talk. So it's words like that and because, and things that point to some other part of the data. So in any line, you could think, well, how far back in the data do I have to read in order to understand what's being said here? That constitutes the furthest referent for that line. So for one line, maybe I don't need to know anything. The line is just clear on its own. Maybe somebody's just responding to the previous line. That's all I need to know. Maybe I have to go back 4 or 5 lines in the data to make sense of it. So for each line, there's some distance back. So now imagine that I sampled 200 lines of data, like just randomly in the data set. And I calculated for each one how far back I have to go. Well, if I were to make that a histogram, the histogram is going to look something like this, right? At one line back, at one line back, a lot of them are going to go 1 line back. Very few of them are going to go 10 lines back. So there's some sort of curve here, right? And so you're sort of looking for the inflection point of that curve, would be the easiest way to put it. So that's sort of thing one. Thing two is that you can just try it. Like when you're running the analyses, what you'll find is there's usually one place where there's a big break. Like if you just say it's only the lines themselves, and then you go to one line, the model will change. And then it'll change a little bit, and eventually it'll stop changing very much. Why? Because the amount of new information being added is relatively low. And a simpler way of putting that is, it doesn't actually matter if you get the exact number. Every time we've looked at this, Like the difference between a window size of 4 and a window size 5 isn't that big. Why? Because if let's say I had a window size of 20, or let's say I had a window size of 200, and then I wanted to see whether 201 was much different. Well, of course it's not going to be much different. I'm adding one bit of information on top of 200 of them. Right? So the further out I go, the less the lines are influential, which makes sense, right? So the second answer is sort of you don't have to sweat about it. And the third is that we're actually developing a technique that will essentially automatically determine what window size would be that would get you the most information out of the data. And briefly, you can imagine that if you said, okay, I have a window size of 4. If I added a window size of 5, would that be better? And a way to think about that is I could add a window size of 5, and I could add a window size where the last window is literally just random. I'm just adding noise. And if I can't tell the difference between going to 5 in the real data and going to 5 with noise, I shouldn't add the next bit of data because it's equivalent to noise. That makes sense. Basically, the answers are, number 1, calculate it by hand. Number 2, don't worry so much. Number 3, if you wait a year or so, you'll just be able to put your data in and get the answer.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. So we may set an overall stanza window size, and we probably also can set this window size vary depending on the specific context of those subsequences of lines, I guess, mathematically works. Yeah, I don't know.
Sorry, I'm not sure I got the question. Can you just say it again?
Yeah, probably. So my current understanding is that we can set a fixed window size for the population of our data, but we probably also can set varying stanza window size depending on the subsequences of utterances or lines of the text that we put in. Yeah, just a guess.
Yeah, well, yes, so it's theoretically possible. And we could certainly build a model that did that. The question would be, what are the criteria that you would use for deciding, sort of the local criteria you would use for deciding the appropriate stanza window size? And this is something people in NLP have been trying to work on for a long time, detecting topic shifts, for example. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't come up with a grounded hypothesis about when the sequences should be longer and shorter. And I mean, we have to change the algorithm a little bit, but it's of course it's possible to implement it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think what you're saying is there are some properties in the data that I want the algorithm to track, and based on those properties for each line, it's going to determine what its appropriate recent temporal context is. I don't know what those parameters are, but if we knew, we could certainly do that.
Right. Yeah, and I guess it also requires researchers to really know their materials well, so they can decide the length of the subsequences of utterances.
Yeah, I will tell you just sort of for free that one of my students is working on her master's work, and one of the things she's looking at is basically a continuous stanza window. So right now, the way the stanza window works is everything is either in it or not. Another way to think about the stanza window is probabilistically. So if 50% of the time, the line immediately preceding should be in the window, it's one of the furthest reference. Well, a way of thinking about that is instead of just saying, yes, it's in the window, and I'm going to make the co-occurrence 1, you say, I'm going to make the co-occurrence 0.5, because it only has a 50% probability that it should be counted. And then 3 windows back has a lower probability and lower probability, right? So you get a kind of probability curve, which you basically determine the same way that you would with that curve for the stanza window. And it turns out that there are cases where that's a more accurate model than just the kind of step model of the stanza window. But it turns out the step model with the stanza window is really pretty powerful. It's not a bad approximation. We can do better, but you're probably not doing that much disservice to your data and using it. the differences wind up being relatively small.
Thank you.
Yep, that was a great question. Thank you. Bodong, are we, I don't know what time we're supposed to stop, but it looks like we're coming on, one of those times when the big hand is either straight up or straight down.
Yeah, I think this is